What happens when two of television's biggest personalities clash behind the cameras in a way that shocks everyone in the studio? Tonight we're diving into the explosive confrontation between Trevor Noah and Jimmy Kimmel that ended with security being called and one of them being escorted out of the building. This isn't your typical late-night television drama. This is something that cut so deep it revealed the true colors of someone millions of Americans invite into their homes every night. It started like any other Wednesday evening taping of Jimmy Kimmel Live. The studio audience was buzzing with excitement as they settled into their seats, completely unaware they were about to witness television history in the making. Trevor Noah had been booked as a guest to promote his latest comedy special and discuss his unique perspective on American culture from an outsider's point of view. What seemed like a perfect match between two quick-witted comedians would soon turn into something nobody saw coming. The green room backstage was unusually tense that evening. Production assistants noticed Jimmy pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath while reviewing his note cards. Several crew members later described his behavior as agitated and uncharacteristic. Meanwhile, Trevor sat calmly in his designated area, scrolling through his phone and occasionally chuckling at something he was reading. The contrast between the two men's energy was stark and should have been a warning sign of what was about to unfold. When the cameras started rolling, Jimmy delivered his usual monologue with practiced precision, but those who knew him well could detect something different in his delivery. His jokes seemed sharper, more pointed, and there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there in previous shows. The studio audience responded with their typical enthusiasm, but backstage, producers exchanged worried glances as they monitored the situation from their control room. The moment Trevor walked onto the stage, something shifted in the atmosphere. Jimmy's smile appeared forced as he extended his hand for the customary greeting, and Trevor, ever the professional, maintained his characteristic warmth despite sensing the underlying tension. As they took their positions, Jimmy behind his desk and Trevor in the guest chair, the studio lights seemed to cast longer shadows than usual across the set. Jimmy opened the interview with what appeared to be a standard question about Trevor's comedy special, but his tone carried an undertone that made everyone uncomfortable. "So Trevor, tell us about your new special where you once again explain to Americans how backwards we all are." The question was delivered with a smile, but the words hit like a slap across the face. Trevor paused for just a moment, his expression shifting slightly as he processed what had just happened. Instead of taking the bait, Trevor responded with his trademark grace and humor. "Well, Jimmy, I think comedy is about finding the absurdity in all of our experiences, whether you're from South Africa or South Carolina. We all have our blind spots, and sometimes it takes an outsider's perspective to help us see them more clearly." His response was measured and diplomatic, but Jimmy wasn't satisfied with diplomacy. The host leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more confrontational by the second. "But don't you think there's something a bit presumptuous about coming to someone else's country and constantly pointing out what's wrong with it? I mean, we have our own comedians who understand the American experience from the inside." The studio audience began to sense the shift in energy, and several people could be heard shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Trevor maintained his composure, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he realized this wasn't going to be the friendly conversation he had expected. "Jimmy, I think that's an interesting perspective, but comedy has always been about challenging assumptions and making people think. Some of the greatest American comedians, from George Carlin to Dave Chappelle, have built their careers on pointing out uncomfortable truths about society. The fact that I have an outside perspective doesn't make my observations less valid. It just makes them different." Jimmy's laugh in response was hollow and forced, and he began tapping his pen against his desk in a rhythmic pattern that created an uncomfortable soundtrack to the mounting tension. "Different, sure, but is different always better? I mean, when you're constantly criticizing a country that gave you opportunities you never would have had back home, doesn't that seem a little ungrateful?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and even the usually animated studio audience fell completely silent. The camera operators were frantically adjusting their shots, trying to capture every nuance of the increasingly hostile exchange, while the producers in the control room debated whether to cut to commercial early. Trevor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for the first time since taking his seat, his diplomatic facade began to crack. "Jimmy, I think you might be misunderstanding the nature of comedy and criticism. When someone points out areas for improvement, that's not ingratitude, that's engagement. That's caring enough about a place to want it to be better." But Jimmy was just getting started, and his next words would push the conversation past the point of no return. "Oh, so now you're doing us a favor by mocking our politics and our culture on national television? Tell me, Trevor, when was the last time you did a bit about the corruption in South African politics or the problems in your home country? It seems like you save all your harshest criticism for the country that made you famous." The accusation was delivered with a sneer that made it clear this was no longer about comedy or cultural commentary. Trevor's response would mark the moment when the gloves truly came off, and what happened next would shock everyone in that studio, and eventually the millions of viewers who would see the footage that somehow made its way online, despite the network's best efforts to bury it. The tension that had been building since the moment Trevor walked onto the stage was about to explode in a way that would forever change how people viewed both men and the world of late-night television. Trevor's response came with a controlled intensity that sent a chill through the studio. "Jimmy, I've done extensive material about South African politics, corruption, and social issues throughout my entire career. The difference is, American audiences don't tune in to hear about Jacob Zuma or load shedding in Johannesburg. They're here because they want someone to hold up a mirror to their own society. But since you brought it up, let me ask you something. When was the last time you used your platform to challenge anything meaningful? Or do you just stick to safe targets? And celebrity gossip?" The question hit Jimmy like a physical blow, and his face flushed red as he struggled to maintain his composure. The studio audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something that had gone far beyond normal television banter. Several people in the front rows later described the atmosphere as electric and terrifying, as they watched two powerful figures engage in what was clearly a deeply personal battle, disguised as professional discourse. Jimmy's voice rose slightly as he fired back, "Safe targets? I've been doing political comedy for years, Trevor. I was making jokes about politicians when you were still figuring out how to pronounce American city names correctly. Don't lecture me about using my platform when you've built your entire American career on being the outsider who gets to criticize. Everything without taking any real responsibility for solutions." The accusation struck at something fundamental in Trevor's identity as both a comedian and a commentator, and his response revealed a side of him that audiences rarely saw. Responsibility for solutions? Jimmy, comedy isn't about providing solutions. It's about asking the right questions and making people uncomfortable enough to think. But if we're talking about responsibility, let's discuss yours. You have one of the biggest platforms in late-night television, and what do you do with it? You make jokes about celebrity divorces and viral videos while the world burns around us. Jimmy slammed his hand on his desk, causing his coffee mug to rattle and sending a sharp sound through the studio that made several audience members jump. "Don't you dare question my commitment to important issues. I've raised millions of dollars. For charity, I've brought attention to health care. I've used my show to help people in ways you can't even imagine. What have you done besides stand on the sidelines and throw stones?" The personal nature of the attack was now undeniable, and Trevor's response showed that Jimmy had pushed him past his breaking point. "What have I done? I've used comedy to help people process trauma, to understand complex political situations, to bridge cultural divides. I've talked about apartheid, about immigration, about what it means to be an outsider trying to find your place in the world. My comedy comes from lived experience, from real struggle. Where does yours come from, Jimmy? Anger about bad reviews?" The silence that followed was deafening. Even the cameramen seemed frozen as they captured the raw emotion playing out in front of them. Jimmy's face had gone from red to almost purple, and his hands were visibly shaking as he gripped the edge of his desk. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "You want to know where my comedy comes from? It comes from working my ass off in this business for decades, while people like you get handed opportunities because you fit some diversity checkbox that makes executives feel good about themselves." The racist undertone of the comment sent shockwaves through the studio, and several crew members later reported that they felt physically sick hearing it. Trevor sat back in his chair, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to pity as he processed what had just been said. "There it is," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "That's what this is really about, isn't it, Jimmy? It's not about comedy or criticism or cultural commentary. It's about the fact that you can't handle the idea that someone who doesn't look like you or sound like you might actually have something valuable to say." Jimmy's response was immediate and explosive. "Don't you dare turn this into a race issue. This has nothing to do with what you look like and everything to do with what you represent. You represent everything that's wrong with modern comedy. This idea that being different automatically makes you insightful, that having an accent makes your observations more profound." Trevor stood up from his chair, his full height casting a shadow across Jimmy's desk as he leaned forward slightly. "What I represent, Jimmy, is someone who earned their place through talent, hard work, and the ability to make people think while they laugh. What you represent is someone who's so threatened by that, so insecure about their own relevance, that they have to tear others down to feel better about themselves." The studio audience was now visibly uncomfortable, with many people looking toward the exits and others pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a historic moment in television. The producers in the control room were frantically trying to decide whether to cut to commercial, but they were paralyzed by the unprecedented nature of what was unfolding before them. Jimmy rose from behind his desk, his chair rolling backward as he stood to face Trevor directly. "Threatened? By you? That's rich, Trevor. You're a guest on my show, sitting in my chair, on my stage, and you think I'm threatened? Let me tell you something about earning your place. I've been grinding in comedy clubs since before you knew America existed. I've bombed in front of audiences who wanted to throw bottles at me. I've worked my way up from nothing while you got fast-tracked to the top because you had a compelling backstory." Trevor's laugh was cold and humorless as he shook his head. "Fast-tracked? Jimmy, do you have any idea what my life was like before I got here? Do you know what it means to grow up under apartheid? To have your very existence be illegal? Do you understand what it takes to rebuild yourself in a completely different culture, to learn new rhythms of humor, to connect with audiences who have no reference point for your experiences? That's not fast-tracking. That's surviving." The personal revelation seemed to catch Jimmy off guard for a moment, but instead of backing down, he doubled down on his attack. "Surviving? You call getting your own television show surviving? You call making millions of dollars surviving? Give me a break, Trevor. You've turned your sob story into a brand, and now you use it to shield yourself from any legitimate criticism." The cruelty of the comment was breathtaking, and several audience members were now openly uncomfortable, with some getting up to leave. Despite the unusual nature of what they were witnessing, Trevor's response came with a quiet intensity that was somehow more powerful than shouting. "My sob story? Jimmy, my childhood isn't a marketing tool. It's the foundation of who I am and how I see the world. The fact that you can dismiss someone's lived experience as a sob story tells me everything I need to know about who you really are when the cameras aren't rolling." Jimmy's mask completely slipped at that moment, revealing something ugly that had been festering beneath his polished television persona for years. "Who I really am? Let me tell you who I really am, Trevor. I'm someone who doesn't need to constantly remind people about my tragic backstory to get laughs. I'm someone who can make jokes without turning every punchline into a lecture about social justice. I'm someone who understands that comedy is supposed to be entertaining, not educational. Trevor remained standing, his posture straight and dignified despite the venom being directed at him. Entertainment and education aren't mutually exclusive, Jimmy. The greatest comedians in history understood that laughter is most powerful when it comes with insight. But I'm starting to understand why that concept might be foreign to you. It requires a level of depth and empathy that you clearly struggle with. The insult landed with precision, and Jimmy's response was immediate and vicious. Depth? Empathy? You want to talk about empathy? How much empathy do you show for the millions of Americans who work hard, pay their taxes, and just want to laugh without being told how terrible they are? How much empathy do you have for people who love this country despite its flaws, instead of building careers on pointing out every imperfection? Trevor's eyes flashed with genuine anger for the first time in the entire exchange. I have tremendous empathy for working Americans, Jimmy. The difference is, I don't patronize them by pretending everything is fine when it's not. I give them credit for being intelligent enough to handle complexity, to laugh at uncomfortable truths, to grow from being challenged. You apparently think they're too fragile to handle anything more challenging than celebrity gossip and internet memes. The condescension in Trevor's voice seemed to break something inside Jimmy, and he stepped closer to his guest, his voice dropping to an angry whisper that the microphones barely picked up. You arrogant piece of garbage. You think you're so much smarter than everyone else, so much more enlightened. But you're just another foreign opportunist who came here to get rich off American audiences while pretending to be their moral superior. The racist and xenophobic nature of the attack was now undeniable, and several crew members later reported that they had never heard anything so ugly spoken on a television set. Trevor's response was measured but devastating. There it is again, Jimmy. Foreign opportunist. You can't help yourself, can you? Every time you feel threatened, every time someone challenges your mediocrity, you fall back on the same tired playbook. Attack their right to be here, question their motives, suggest they don't belong. Say, Jimmy was breathing heavily now, his professional composure completely abandoned as he faced Trevor across the small space between them. I don't have to suggest anything. You don't belong here. This is American television, American comedy, American culture. You're a tourist who overstayed his welcome and now thinks he owns the place. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to stop humming as everyone in the studio processed what had just been said. Trevor looked around the room, taking in the shocked faces of the audience, the horrified expressions of the crew, and the cameras that were still rolling despite the producer's complete paralysis in the control room. When Trevor finally spoke, his voice was calm and steady, but it carried a weight that made everyone lean forward to hear him. Jimmy, in this moment, in front of all these people and these cameras, you've shown everyone exactly who you are. You've revealed that beneath all the charity work and the political jokes and the carefully crafted image, you're just another person who thinks success means keeping others down, who thinks belonging is determined by birthplace rather than contribution. Jimmy's final response would become the moment that ended his career and changed late-night television forever. Contribution? Your contribution is making Americans hate themselves and their country. Your contribution is turning comedy into therapy for people who are too weak to handle real life. You want to know what I think your real contribution is? You've made it acceptable for outsiders to come here and profit off our self-doubt. Trevor nodded slowly, as if Jimmy had just confirmed something he had suspected all along. And there we have it. The truth about Jimmy Kimmel revealed not in a moment of courage, but in a moment of weakness. You're not angry at me because of my comedy or my criticism or my success. You're angry because I represent something that terrifies you, the possibility that America is big enough and strong enough and confident enough to listen to different voices and still thrive. The security guards were already moving toward the stage, having been called by producers who finally realized that the situation had spiraled completely out of control. But Trevor wasn't finished. The saddest part about all of this, Jimmy, is that you had a choice. You could have used this moment to engage in the kind of meaningful dialogue that your audience deserves. Instead, you chose to reveal the smallness of your spirit and the poverty of your imagination. Jimmy's last words, as security approached, were delivered with a snarl that distorted his features into something unrecognizable from the jovial host millions knew from television. "Get him out of here. Get this ungrateful foreigner off my set before I do something we'll both regret." Trevor straightened his jacket and walked toward the security guards with dignity intact, pausing only to address the stunned studio audience directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, you came here tonight expecting entertainment, and instead you witnessed something much more valuable. You saw what happens when someone's true character is revealed under pressure. Remember this moment, because it tells you everything you need to know about the difference between real courage and performance courage." As Trevor was escorted from the building, not as a troublemaker but as someone who had simply been subjected to an unprecedented attack, Jimmy stood alone on his stage, breathing heavily and staring at the shocked faces of his audience. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second of his meltdown, and the footage that would later surface would show a man who had completely lost control of himself, his show, and his reputation. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, many of them recording on their phones despite official policies against it, knowing they had witnessed something that would be talked about for years to come. The crew members stood frozen at their positions, unsure of how to proceed with a show that had just imploded in the most spectacular fashion in late-night television history. What had started as a routine celebrity interview had become a masterclass in how prejudice and insecurity can destroy a career in a matter of minutes, and how grace under pressure can reveal character in ways that years of scripted television never could.